evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's conversation, Escaping the Holocaust, featuring authors Jonathan Friedland and Weina Dai Randel, moderated by Stephanie Butnick. My name is Jenna Weiss, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programs at the Jewish Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event, which kicks off the spring 2023 season of Unpacking the Book, Jewish Writers in Conversation, co-presented by the Jewish Museum, Jewish Book Council, and Tablet Magazine. If this is your first time attending an Unpacking the Book event, welcome. You can watch many of our past programs on Jewish Book Council's YouTube page. After the event, please visit the museum's website to sign up for our e-news for information about all of our upcoming events, including the 2 book programs in April and May, which will be held live in person at the Jewish Museum for the first time since 2020. If you come early to those events, you'll be able to visit the museum's galleries, including the exhibition The Sassoons, opening March 3rd. And for those of you tuning in from further away, we also offer virtual tours for groups of any size, so come with your book club. Tickets and more information at thejewishmuseum.org/visit. Closed captioning is available tonight for those who wish to use it. Simply click on the CC icon at the bottom of your screen to watch the event with captions turned on. Before we begin, I would like to introduce Naomi Firestone-Teeter, Executive Director of Jewish Book Council, to share a little bit more about tonight's program.
Thank you, Jenna. As always, I am pleased to be able to welcome you on behalf of Jewish Book Council. We're thrilled to present the Unpacking the Book series for its 9th year in partnership with the Jewish Museum and Tablet Magazine. While tonight's program is virtual, as it has been for the last 3 years, as Jenna mentioned, we're excited to welcome you all back in person for the second 2 events in the season's lineup. Each program we've offered in the series brings together authors who approach similar subject matter through their own unique lens. Tonight, we will share stories about escaping the Holocaust, fact, fiction, and the sometimes blurred line between them, with authors Jonathan Friedland and Weina Dai Randel, who each explore the subject in their recently published books, The Escape Artist, The Man Who Broke Out of Auschwitz to Warn the World, and Night Angels, respectively. They'll be joined by our always wonderful moderator, Stephanie Butnick. Our mission at Jewish Book Council is to educate, enrich, and strengthen the community through Jewish literature. You can visit our website to learn more about our reviews, essays, and literary journal Paper Brigade, our book club resources and author tours, and our literary awards, including the National Jewish Book Awards and Tion Notable Books. And I must note here that Jonathan recently won not only 1 National Jewish Book Award for The Escape Artist, but 2, one in biography and one in Holocaust. I hope you will check out all of our programs, events, including our upcoming National Jewish Book Award celebration on March 1st, and resources, and consider becoming a member to support JBC's continued initiatives. JBC is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we rely on the generosity of supporters like you to accomplish our work. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to very quickly thank, of course, the Jewish Museum and Jenna Weiss, and our media sponsor, Tablet Magazine, the premier publication of Jewish news and ideas in the U.S. A very special thank you as well to Evie Sapphire Bernstein, Jewish Book Council's program director, for managing all the ins and outs of this program. And as always, I'm especially grateful to JBC's board of directors for their continued support of Jewish literature, ideas, and conversation. A few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. If you would like to ask a question of our panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please also be in the lookout in the chat for links to purchase this evening's books. I hope you'll purchase both of our panelists' books and give them as gifts if you have not already done so. And now I'd like to introduce you to Stephanie. Stephanie Butnick is the deputy editor of Tablet Magazine and a host of its weekly podcast, Unorthodox. She is the author, along with her co-hosts, of the newest Jewish encyclopedia, From Abraham to Zabars and Everything in Between. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the evening.
Naomi, Jenna, thank you so much for having me. It is great to be here. I'm so excited to get back in person, but if we were in person tonight, we would not be able to do this event because I am joined by 2 wonderful authors who are not based here. So I would love it if, I think we should start from farthest away to closest. Jonathan, I think you win for farthest away. Will you tell us who you are, where you are, and that's it. And then we'll get into your books.
Sure. No, my name is Jonathan Friedland, and I am in the top room in my house in London, England, where it is 7 minutes past midnight. And I will occasionally perhaps talk quietly so as not to wake anyone else up in the house. But no, don't worry, I won't do that.
So my name is Weina Dai Randel. I'm in Boston right now. It's 7:07. I think it's the same in New York.
Yes, it is. So I am so excited to be here with both of you. These are their books. They are amazing in person, on your however you choose to read and purchase these. I encourage you to. And the links to buy all these books will be in the chat, peppered throughout the chat throughout the night. Let's just jump in. I would love it if each of you could just tell us what your book is about for our viewers. I was going to say our listeners, our viewers who have not yet had the great pleasure of reading them. Weina, let's start with you.
Okay, so Night Angels is a novel of a diplomatic couple who risk their lives to save Jews by issuing them visas. It's based on a true story of Dr. Hofenshan, who was honored as righteous among nations.
Well, good. I'll go next. This book is The Escape Artist is about Rudolf Verber, who aged just 19 escaped from Auschwitz. Extremely rare for a Jewish prisoner to escape from Auschwitz. Only a handful ever achieved that. He did it in April 1944, and he did it along with Fred Wetzler. There were two of them, Slovakian Jews. They did it with a very clear motive, which was to warn the world, and particularly to warn Jews. Rudolf Verber's great insight, having been in Auschwitz as a prisoner for the best part of 2 years, again, extremely unusual. As people watching this will know, the life expectancy of a Jew in Auschwitz was really measured in hours. For prisoners, it was usually just a matter of months. He was there for nearly 21 months, extremely unusual. And his great insight was to realize that almost everybody, in fact, every Jew who arrived had no idea where they had been brought to. They all thought they were being resettled for new lives, had no idea they were being brought to a place of death. And his great insight was, if people knew the fate that awaited them, then perhaps they would behave differently. Instead of getting on and off those deportation trains in relatively calm, relatively orderly fashion, they would perhaps panic and stampede, and there would be chaos. And he understood, having watched it, that process would be disastrous for the Nazis, that they relied on order and calm. And so he thought the only way to not halt, but to throw sand in the gears of the Nazi killing machine was for somebody to get out and warn the Jews of Europe what happened in Auschwitz, because he was sure that they had no idea. And so with the tremendous and inspiring kind of arrogance of youth as a teenager, he thought, somebody has to get out of this place and tell the world what's happening here, and that person might as well be me. And how he did it is, to my mind, obviously I'm biased, but a completely thrilling adventure story, how he did it. And then there's a whole lot more to say about how then the world reacted once they did get this news, which is a story of a rather different kind.
So Jonathan, your interest in this story starts when you were just a teenager. Could you tell us sort of about discovering this story and then returning to it again as, a very well-known journalist, and also how you went about using your reportorial skills, your skills of a journalist to report the story and to write it down in this book?
Well, thank you for all those things you just said there. I mean, it is quite true that I was a teenager. I was, in fact, Verber's age. I was 19 when I was in a London cinema movie theatre seeing the film, again, familiar probably to some of the people watching this tonight, that 9.5-hour epic documentary, Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, shown in 2 parts, 4.5 hours each, a long, really unusual documentary. Again, people who've seen it will know there's no archive in it. It's just made up of interviews. And it was a series, it seemed to me, age 19, of to my eyes, very old, very broken, defeated men and women, until one person appears on the screen and absolutely explodes onto the screen with huge charisma, a head of thick, dark, lustrous hair. He speaks English, whereas everyone else is speaking Polish or Russian. He's in New York City. It's the 1970s. He's wearing a tan leather coat. He looks like Al Pacino in Scarface or something. He looks just like a movie star. And his name is Rudolf Werber, and it's mentioned almost as an aside, actually, that he escaped from Auschwitz. And even as a 19-year-old, I knew that Jews basically didn't escape from Auschwitz. So I was already intrigued. The film didn't say much, but I never forgot about Rudolf Werber. And it was there at the back of my mind for decades, until around, in recent years, 2016 particularly, I found myself thinking of Rudolf Werber again. And that's because 2016 was the year of post-truth. It was the year of Donald Trump in America, Brexit in this country, lots of conversations about misinformation and disinformation. And I found myself going back to this story, which I knew was really turned on questions of truth, because Werber's determination to get out of Auschwitz was because he believed very strongly that the difference between truth and lies would be and could be the difference between life and death. So in this era of post-truth, I thought to myself, this story is a kind of definitive story about truth and about the importance of facts and getting the truth out, because that's what Werber had been doing. So I found myself going back to it. I did look around and see who was, how I might even begin with this story. And I did stumble across this fact that he had been married. His first wife had lived for a while in England, and nobody I spoke to knew where she was or if she was even still alive. I worked out she would be 93 years old if she was still alive. And, to cut a long story short, I sent what journalists often do, is you sort of send an email to an imagined email address. You work out what someone's email address might be. That I knew she'd once taught at a college in London, and I sort of constructed first name, last name. And I sent this email very confident that it would bounce back and say, undelivered or undeliverable. And instead, I got an email back about 20 minutes later saying, dear Jonathan, you are in luck. I live 20 minutes away from where you do, And I went to see Goethe Verbova, and we sat in her garden in the COVID summer of 2020. We had to be outdoors. You couldn't, social distancing. And she told me about the man she had been married to, but it emerged that she had actually known Rudolf Werber before he went to Auschwitz. They had been teenage sweethearts. And she remembered the boy, the 14-year-old boy who, before he'd gone to Auschwitz. After about 6 of those conversations, I think it was the last one, she said to me, and I'll conclude with this, she said, I've got something for you. My grandson is here because there's something upstairs that is too heavy for me to carry. And her grandson came downstairs with a red suitcase, and the two of them quite ceremoniously handed this to me. And Goethe, age 93, said, "Those are Rudy's letters. I want you to have them." And at that moment, I had a feeling that somehow I was meant to write this book. And that was the breakthrough moment in telling the story.
So Weina, let's talk about meant to write these stories. The stories of Jews who escaped the Nazis through Shanghai are much lesser known, though a fascinating part of Holocaust history. So how did you learn about the real Dr. Ho Fengshan, who was China's consul general in Vienna during this period of time, during the 1930s? And can you first tell us about his story, and then really just tell us what inspired you to create a novel based on the framework of his story? And then, of course, what kind of research, this is a series of questions, what kind of research goes into a project like that to get the broad strokes of the time and the place right, and then also build your own, fictionalized story around it?
Oh, okay. So let's start with Dr. Ho Fengshan. He was born in China, and he in May 1938, after the Anschluss, he was the consul general of Chinese consulate in Vienna, and he witnessed the Nazi terror, and he really empathized with those Jews, and he decided to issue them visas against the order of his superior. Because of his visas, many people were able to flee Austria and going to Shanghai and other places in the country as well. And they escaped the Holocaust that way. The story was brought to me when I was writing The Last Rose of Shanghai. And actually, it was brought to me by a friend who's the person urged me to write The Last Rose of Shanghai. The Last Rose of Shanghai, of course, you know, is a love story between a Chinese woman and a Jewish refugee who fled to Shanghai from Nazi Germany. So my friend said, Weina, since you wrote this, why don't you write another prequel and tell people, give people an understanding of how these Jews actually came to Shanghai. So she got me really interested in that, and I looked into the historical records. So for historical record research, oh man, this is going to be a very long list. So for Dr. Ho's story, I started with his memoir in traditional Chinese and also the abridged English translation by his son, Mantou Ho, who was with him at that time. I also look into Mantou's memoir to verify those both accounts. For historical events such as the Anschluss and the Kristallnacht timeline and World War II photos, I consulted encyclopedias, the US Holocaust Museum, and books such as The World Must Know and The Forefront War. For Adolf Eichmann, oh man, so this is a very serious matter, so I turned to serious books by many scholar books and the website such as annefrank.org. In the novel Night Angels, you will know there were three narratives. One was written from Dr. Ho's perspective. The other is Dr. Ho's wife, Grace, and also Lola Schnitzler, who was the Jewish girl in the novel. So for me, because I was unable to travel to Vienna at that time, Night Angels is a pandemic book. I was not able to travel there. So I had to really look into the city and the people and the culture. So what I did with Lola Schnitzler, I relied on the memoirs written by survivors who went to Shanghai and also US. I can mention a few. I think 10 Green Bottles, and We Must Never Forget, and those two novels, those two memoirs. For historical background of the Chinese diplomatic relations, which was very difficult to find because at that time, you know, Dr. Ho Fenshan was working for the nationalist government. Actually, he was always a nationalist, but you know, nationalist is the government of Taiwan. So a lot of documents about them have been destroyed in China. So it was very difficult to find. I found the articles and journals through JSTOR mostly. So for me, it was also very important to get a sense of Austrian culture and the mindset of the Austrians so I could describe Lola and how the people felt in Vienna at that time. So I immersed myself into stories written by Austrian authors such as Arthur Schnitzler and Stefan Zweig. I know everybody loves Stefan Zweig. His books are amazing.
I like that the character makes a joke because her last name is Schnitzler.
Oh my
And she
goodness!
says no relation, but
Yes.
that was actually in your mind, right?
Yes, yeah, you got that. Oh my God, I'm so happy you did. So there's something else too, is like because it's a diplomatic story, and I had to really look into diplomatic relations of all the countries in the book. So I actually dug into Franklin Roosevelt's archive, and I read John C. Wiley's wife, Irina Wiley's memoir, so I could really understand how those diplomats act and how those relationships were. So here's a fun fact. When I was doing research, I heard that after the Anschluss, all the diplomatic relationship reshuffled because Austria lost the statehood. Austria became a province of the Greater Germany. So all those foreign legations, they were kind of demoted. Those embassies became consulates, and those ambassadors, they became consul generals. So I wanted to write that part in the novel, and I discovered that the British embassies, British legation, they sold the building in Vienna to the Nazi Flying Corps. And American embassy, they stayed in the same building, and they just changed the size to become a consulate. But I couldn't find anything about French embassy. But I really want to know, and I know what do they do, right? Because they were three most powerful countries at that time. So I looked online, I couldn't find any reliable sources. So I posted on my Facebook asking for help. Nobody could find the reliable sources for me, and they did not know what happened to French embassies. So eventually somebody said, Weina, why don't you email French embassy in Vienna, and they will help you find the records. And I was like, okay, this is a great idea. I should do that totally. So I emailed French embassy, and the cultural director forwarded my email to somebody who was in charge of the archive. And the person who's in charge of the archive replied to me a week later, and he said, all those documents were destroyed during the war. The only reliable source that he could tell me to go was Wikipedia. And then on Wikipedia, I discovered exactly what the French embassies did. They left the building and they packed up all the silverware and shipped them to Paris. I mean, with all the chaos going on, the most important thing for them was to pack up the silverware. So that's what I wrote in the novel.
Jonathan, did you have a question for Weina?
It wasn't a question, actually. I was just going to, am I still on mute? Or am I? No, I'm all right.
No, we hear you.
No, I was just going to note how interesting it is that both of us had to resort to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt archives.
Yes.
That's where Rudolf Verber's papers have been kept for the last 10 or plus years. There's a vast archive there. Very difficult it was for me to access it during COVID, but I did manage to do that. And, you know, partly because the word that Rudolf Verber and Fred Wetzler did eventually manage to smuggle out from Auschwitz took the form of this report, a 32-page single-spaced report, the Verber-Wetzler report, which was a product of them dictating what they had seen in Auschwitz to the tiny Jewish community that was left in Slovakia, who typed it up and put it in this report. And it then went on this incredible journey of its own, where it was almost like an escape story. It was passed from hand to hand by people in the resistance, people in secret, across borders. It had to cross occupied Europe. But it did eventually reach, yes, Winston Churchill in London, but also Roosevelt in New York. And it was because it reached Roosevelt in New York that the Roosevelt administration, that there was this perceived connection, and therefore the people who are the directors and trustees of the Roosevelt Museum thought it would be appropriate for them to have and hold the Verber archive, even though, maybe we'll come on to talk about this, you could read the story of what actually happened and feel that Roosevelt did not really act on the warning that Rudolf Verber and Fred Wetzler had smuggled out, and therefore in a way had let down, Roosevelt in a way had let down Verber, but nevertheless those are where his papers are. And so Weina and I had in common that resort to the FDR library.
Yeah, actually I was going to ask you that, because Jonathan, I read your book and was like, wow, Jonathan, where did you find this document? Where did you go? I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, the report itself is out there. I mean, it's on the internet. You can see the report, but all the other papers that Rudy left behind are stored in boxes at the FDR library, with the exception of those letters that were in that red suitcase. They were given to me personally and hadn't really ever been seen before.
And I was really disappointed to see, even though Winston Churchill was so angry about the treatment, but then he did nothing. Nobody did. And this was just very disappointing. And in your book, you also talk about the deception of those Nazis, and those many people who were shipped to the camp did not even know. They thought they were looking for a better life. And there was one instance that really caught my attention, was the woman who was from Hungary, or
from Czechoslovakia, yeah.
Czechoslovakia, and she was warned what's going to happen in the camp, and she was so angry. She's like, "What are you talking about?" And she reported to the guard about this. I was like, "Oh my goodness!" So that became very important for Rudolph to escape the camp. But then after that, it was even more disappointment. So I feel like the whole Holocaust, and so many people, it was caused because it was a result of tyranny. It was also caused because it was a result of the aloofness of the world and the silence of the outsiders. People just watched it happen.
Yes, I mean, I've read your book too, in Night Angels, and the idea of the figure, your Dr. Ho, is the exception rather than the rule. Somebody who does act, and most people did not act. Most people did nothing, and the sort of second half, in a way, of my book is about the response to this report and the lack of response, which is what you're picking up on. And the defenders of Winston Churchill would say, look, he was really appalled by what he read, and he did instruct his colleagues to at least talk to the Air Force about bombing the railway tracks to Auschwitz. I mean, the thinking there, this has all come out again anew in these acclaimed documentaries by Ken Burns that were aired on American TV just a couple of months ago. But this is a perennial debate. But the assumption was that, look, Auschwitz is something that has never really existed in human history before, which is a killing factory, a factory devoted to the production of human corpses, which is a horrible way of putting it, but that is what it was. And therefore, Jewish leaders, when they sent the report that 19-year-old Rudy and Fred had smuggled out, they sort of attached, with, as it were, a paperclip on the front saying, here's the evidence. Now, here's what we want you to do. We want you to bomb the railway tracks, because if this is a factory, then the railway tracks are the conveyor belt to the factory. So the way to stop production at this death factory called Auschwitz is to destroy those railway tracks. And Churchill does say to his Air Force, look, what about it? They say, impossible. This would have to be done during the day. And we, the British, we bomb at night. Talk to the Americans. And then the action in the story moves over to the Americans. And in Washington, people have Rudy's report, and somebody writes a note in the memo and then sends it over to somebody else's desk, and they sit and they talk about it and they have a meeting. And each day that this is being passed from one person to another, another 15,000 people were being killed. At Auschwitz at that stage, in the summer of 1944, the system had become so efficient that the death rate had gone up to between 12 and 15,000 Jews a day being killed. So every day there was some diplomat in Washington saying, I'm not sure about this. Why don't we see, are you free on Wednesday? No, why don't we meet on Thursday? That's another 15,000 Jews every minute you're waiting. And that is what, in later life, that hesitation would drive Rudolf Verber, with fury, because he was so aware that every day his warning was not acted upon, lives were lost that didn't need to be. And I think just some of that, Weina, came through to me in your novel, because you have Dr. Ho feels that sense that every hour that passes that he's not signing visas, that he's not got a pen in his hand signing, is another life gone, another life gone. And the people who were aware of this felt it so intensely and keenly. But the rest of the world, yes, there were the Nazis themselves doing the killing. The responsibility and blame belongs frontally with them, primarily with them. But there were these other people, basically everyone, who either didn't know, or if they did know, didn't do enough. The people who did do, who acted, are very much in the tiny, tiny minority. Dr. Ho in your book, or the you know, the people who I pick up on in mine. But, you know, most people preferred not to know, or if they did know, preferred not to act.
It's so interesting because, you know, what you just said really struck me, this idea of there's two smuggling out stories in this book, right? You have the sort of I was thinking it's like Argo meets Shawshank Redemption plus Nazis.
Yeah.
That's how I feel like the Rudy section is. It's like, you know, it's a thriller, right? What will happen to him? How will he get out? And then you see this document just get clogged in like the bureaucracy, and you see this heroism in the first half of what Rudy did, and then you see just everyone doing nothing. And I think that is really interesting to sort of compare it with Dr. Ho, who's basically his wife in the book, right? In the novel, his wife is like, you have to do this. And he goes against these orders. And so I think the way in which the sort of nimbleness of just one person saying, I'm going to do this thing that no one thinks I should do, or no one knows if it's a good idea, but I feel strongly about it. And I think that compared with this sort of like the slog of paperwork to get here, to even get it to New York, I mean, it's just sort of so depressing and disheartening.
Yeah, I agree, Stephanie. I do agree. And I think another beauty of Jonathan's work is he gave the arc of Rudolph's entire life, from when he was young to basically to his death, and why he was named the escape artist. As I was reading the book, I was like, whoa, he's a professional escaper, you know. And then you do see that the second half of the book was about the trauma and the wound, and how he became a man, a broken man. He would never be able to recover. And I was really happy to see him meet somebody in Boston, yay. And finally found a period of peace.
Yes.
Yes, it is very difficult. I think that the book was beautifully done, the entire arc. And in comparison, Night Angel, I narrowed it down to 3 years of Dr. Ho's life in Vienna. And the book was mostly involved around him and his family and all the people around him.
Yeah, thank you, Weina, for what you said about my book, and that's very generous of you to say that. It's interesting about the 3 years thing, because when I initially was talking about the escape artist, I think the publishers that I first discussed it with did also think that's what you should do. You should just tell the story of Auschwitz and the escape. And I was always very determined to tell the story of the whole life, partly because I think that you know, to me, that was also one of the interesting themes about this, about what enduring in huge trauma does to, I was going to say to somebody, but it's actually, it goes beyond just the one person. I don't want to, in a way, give away what happens to the next generation of Rudy's family, you know, because you've read it, but, you know, the trauma is visited down the generations. And this is something that, you know, I know that there are people who write about intergenerational trauma, but there is great sort of damage that this can do to one life, and it can be, the echoes of it are felt down the generations. And I wanted, in a way, to tell the story of a whole life rather than just this immediate adventure. But Stephanie, your point, I think, is really central. It is a very dispiriting thought that the individual who does something really heroic, they do the hard bit in a way. That was the hard thing. To escape from Auschwitz was so difficult. It required such physical courage. We haven't talked about how he did it, which is good, because I want people to read the book.
No, we're not going to talk about it. No spoilers here. You got to buy it.
That at all, but it required physical courage, but also tremendous ingenuity. It's such a brilliant idea. And, you know, like a lot of men my age, I sort of grew up with wartime escape stories and watched the Great Escape movie and everything. And, you know, I'm biased again, but to me, it is the most thrilling escape story of the whole of the Second World War. That he'd done his bit. The other things that people had to do were the easy bit, about memos and meetings. And you know, that was, you weren't in Auschwitz, you were in an office in Whitehall in London or in Washington. And yet they are the people who failed. And I do think, you know, in our world now, and I'm not comparing these two things, but you just think about, you know, whether it is the detention of the Uyghurs in China, or if you think it is about the climate crisis, or if you think it's about, you know, Russia and Ukraine, there are people, you know, witnessing or enduring really hard, tough things, and all they ask of the rest of the world is in a way to read the words that they have brought out and to do something about it. And yet that's often where these things fall down. And I think, just last thing on this, I do think it does come down to something quite human, which is that it is very difficult, I think, for people to believe something which is truly awful and frightening. And so, there's evidence in this book of Jewish people being warned about Auschwitz, and I think Weina was picked up on this story, the Czech woman who has arrived at Auschwitz. One of the prisoners there warns her and says, look, you're going to be gassed, you and your children. And she doesn't just not, ignore the warning. She's angry with him for saying such a terrible thing and reports him to an SS man. This man has just told me something terrible. And there is another story like that too, where a group, later on in the book, a group of people, Jews, are in a cattle car on their way to Auschwitz. Somebody in the cattle car happens to know what happens in Auschwitz and tells them we should all jump off this train, because if we don't, we are going to be gassed at the other end. Again, they don't just disbelieve him, they turn violent against him. They start beating him. And they call the German guards and said, you've got to deal with this person who has said something terrible. As it happens, the terrible thing he has said is the truth. And people really, really struggle with the truth. And just after I'd finished this book, that movie Don't Look Up came out, about a comet sort of hurtling towards Earth. It's a kind of parable of climate change. The point being, people will not even look up at the sky if it means facing something terrible. We prefer to put our fingers in our ears and not face it. And Rudy's experience is a very extreme, intense version of that. He couldn't forgive the people who had not heard his story or acted on it or passed it on. But again, I think he ran headlong into a very human weakness, which is, as a species almost, we find it really hard to hear dire warnings of our own destruction. And that is the warning he was bringing out to the Jews of Europe.
So we have a lot of people saying, what was in the suitcase? What were the letters? Who were they to? What language were they in? What are you going to do with them? How did this woman end up in the UK? So we'll just tell us a little bit about what was in the suitcase.
So Goethe and Rudy had been childhood sweethearts in a provincial town in Slovakia, Trnava. They met again after Rudy had escaped, and they married, and they lived together in post-war Prague and had 2 children. And the marriage went disastrously wrong. It was a very, very bad and acrimonious marriage. And the 2 of them, and this is, his half is why the book is called The Escape Artist. As Weina said, he was a serial escapologist. He constantly escaped, and he escaped from post-war communist Czechoslovakia. So he had to, in his life, escape from 2 totalitarian regimes, from the Nazis in Auschwitz, from Cold War communist Czechoslovakia. He escaped. She did too, with their children, and she took the children to England. He then tracked them down to England, and it was very, very bitter. They had divorced. There were arguments about custody and access. But he did want a relationship with his children, who were raised from a very young age in England, and therefore the language he had to write to his children in was English. And so this suitcase was really full of letters from Rudy to his, as it were, English children. So they were in English, going back from the 60s right through until, months before he died in 2006. So it was 40 years worth of letters. There were some letters as well in German to various scholars that he was in touch with in Germany. So there was a whole, but the really unique thing were these long and sometimes very anguished letters to his daughters. Again, I don't want to spoil or give away things that are in the story, but one letter was 42 pages long, handwritten, and pouring out stuff that was so intimate and so personal. It enabled me, even if, I do quote from the letters, but even if I hadn't, what it gave me was this sense of the man, rather than just this public figure, the way he presented himself when he was interviewed by historians, when he appeared as a witness in war crimes trials, which he did often, when he was being interviewed by Claude Lanzmann in that documentary. I had the public Rudy and how he presented himself, but what I had in these letters was the sort of inner man who, as he presented himself to his ex-wife and his daughters, and that enabled me really to see that, well, to use Weina's very good word, the sort of arc of his life and who he really was. And that's why I feel this book does get under the, I hope, it's not for me to say, but the objective was to get under the skin of this man, rather than just this sort of what had been told before, I think, by others, not by him, because he wrote his own memoir in the 1960s, but others had given a sort of historical account of what had happened, slightly two-dimensional, which didn't really get into Rudolf Verber the man, and that's what I wanted to do.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, I think this is definitely one way to write a historical figure of importance. Like you can write it as a nonfiction and write nonfiction, but with thrillers elements in it, which Jonathan is very good at doing that. And for me, it was important to bring different voices in historical novel. The different voices include Lola, who was Jewish, Jewish Michelin, because she's a half-blood, she's of mixed blood, and also Dr. Hoffenschan's wife at that time, Grace Lee, because there was, for me, it's important to bring women's voice into history because I feel there's not enough stories about women. So in this story, I wanted to see the dynamics between all of them three. You can see this diplomat who acted on his conscience. He wanted to do the right thing, but you can also see the friendship between an American woman and a local Jewish girl. For me, it was even more important personally because with Lola and Grace, it's almost personal because I'm a stranger acquainted to strange events in life. When my daughter was an infant, she still had this red hair from her great grandmother, who was Polish. So every time when I took her to the park or shopping at Kohl's, there were people who were very nice and they came over and they're like, "Wow, what a cute girl. Are you her nanny?" So this kind of experience made me think, what would it be for a woman in 1930s to live in Vienna? And also because at that time, in Vienna, in 1938, that was 3 years after the enactment of Nuremberg Law, which bans the marriage between Jews and non-Jews, which stripped away all the rights of Jews, stripped away the citizenship, and made them subject of the state. And if you were half blood, half Jewish, or quarter Jewish, you would need to have this kind of identification to prove yourself that you belong to this category. And if you belong to this category 1 or category 2, and depending on how much Jewish blood you have, there will be consequences. And I discovered that when I was researching John C. Wiley's documents. John C. Wiley, who was the American General Counsel, and he was reporting to the State Department. In his report, he said a Viennese Jew who was half Jewish, a Michelin, was denied of admission to public hospitals because he was a Jew. And then when he went to the Jewish clinic, he was denied of admission again because he was not a Jew. So I brought these stories together and I found out I thought it was important to feature Lola as mixed blood as well. But with this identity is usually like today in America, many people who are mixed blood, they don't give it much thought. They never realize they will have consequences if you had half blood or quarter blood, Jewish blood in Greater Germany during World War II. I was very surprised after the book launch of Night Angels. I did this presentation, and somebody who I know, she's my son's friend's mother, and she's Catholic. And then she came up to me. She said, "Weina, do you know I'm actually half Jewish as well? I never knew this would happen." And this is something that made me think, we should have more novels about mixed people, about their lives, and we can understand what kind of special situation they were in World War II. And even today, actually, my daughter, she's 14. She got the first job working as cashier in a grocery store, and one day she was checking out a grocery from a customer, and then suddenly the customer asked her, "Are you half and half?" And she freaked out. She's like, well, yeah, I'm half." And then the customer said, "Which half?" She's like, "Why is this a big deal?" And she came home and she was crying, and I will never forget this.
It's so interesting, the theme of tonight is this idea of fact fiction, and as it's put, the sometimes blurry line in between. So when I sort of want to ask this to both of you, but when your novel is a fictionalized version of a real person's story, and Lola is sort of a fictional character, Grace, her story is fictionalized. What do we say, like, what do you say to people who say, you can't, this is the historical record, you can't play with it? Is there a worry? I'm curious for both of you, this idea that fictionalized accounts of something so seminal in Jewish history and world history somehow take away from the historical record or memory, or is there room for both? And do we need art that draws on or plays with these stories? I'm curious. I'd love to put this to you first, Weina, because I know this is something that you've been sort of dealing with in the aftermath of the launch of this book.
Well, I definitely hope there's room because, in some countries, some topics cannot be discussed, and fictions about that traumatic period of history or fictions about certain topics were banned by the government. And writers who write those part of history or write about that topic were ostracized and attacked. I certainly hope this will not happen in this country.
Should I pick up some of this, Stephanie, or
Sure, yeah.
or Weina?
No, I want to know what you think.
I mean, I did wonder reading your book, reading Weina's book. I did think, well, the Doctor Who story is so fascinating. I would be delighted to read just a regular non-fictional biography of him. And it's partly informed by the way I felt about the Verba story. His Verba's own obsession was for truth and facts, and therefore I felt it sort of rubbed off on me. I felt obsessive about making sure this book was true, and every word in it I could trace to a documentary source. And so there's tons of end notes, like footnotes at the back of the book with every little detailed source. And there's one thing, I mention this only because readers have picked up on it. At one point I described Rudy feeling a bead of sweat forming on his back, and somebody said to me, "Oh, so that's just you, the former thriller writer, you made that up, right?" No, that's in a letter, that's in a document. Verba said that. He said, "At that point I felt a bead of sweat, particularly on my back." Anything that's in the book, I felt compelled, had to have a historical source, and I felt.
By the way, you have
truthful.
50 pages of footnotes at the back.
50 pages. I mean,
yeah, that's
not as long as it
so,
seems.
yeah.
It really,
so
it
you
was.
need that.
It was really, for me, it felt very a requirement. Now, why? It's because it's this subject. There are people who want to say that the Holocaust did not happen, who want to deny the truth of the Holocaust, and want to say it's a made-up story, it's fiction. And therefore, I have moved on this because I once did myself a thriller that had it was set in the present day, but it had a kind of Holocaust element. And I now, I have mixed feelings about it now, because I think maybe this is the one subject that actually, if you do it, you need to be factual about it, simply because there are people who want to say fiction, non-fiction, what's the difference? It's all a made-up story. And so you do it so well, Weina, but the fact that Adolf Eichmann is in your book as a sort of, as it were, fictional character, I can't pretend it doesn't on some level trouble me, because I want people to realize Eichmann's a real character. He's not something that a novelist made up. So I'm torn on it, because it's really good that you've brought the incredible story of Shanghai and Dr. Ho and the visas to a whole new audience who would never read a nonfiction book. On the other hand, I do have a concern that when it comes to the Holocaust, we've got to bend over backwards to tell people this is true. It's a real event that is documented, and not to mess around with it. So that's being honest about my own sort of conflicted feelings about it.
Yeah, I certainly respect your opinion, Jonathan, and I'm very grateful that you actually brought up Adolf Eichmann. For me, it was very important to feature him in this novel as well, for a few reasons. People who are familiar with the Holocaust, they wouldn't know the timeline of Adolf Eichmann. I'm sorry. So he arrived. He was in. If you look into the history, he was in Vienna in March, a week after the Anschluss. He was raiding the Jewish congregations, arresting people, and later in August, then he would become the chief of immigration office. But people would also wonder, were there really interactions between Eichmann and the diplomat? So in Dr. Hofenstein's memoir, he actually never mentioned the encounter between them. And he actually, in Dr. Hofenstein's memoir, he did not mention any official Nazi official's name in his memoir, which is very diplomatic, I think. But in the scholarly books about Eichmann, for instance, the book Eichmann Before Jerusalem, there were specific statements saying that there were direct interactions between Eichmann's office and Japanese consulate and Chinese consulate, because Eichmann was trying very hard to have mass Jewish immigration to those two countries. Eichmann actually directed one of his old acquaintances to contact those consulates. So there were interactions between those consulates. But do you think they actually came across and they met each other? I don't know. But as fiction writer, we needed to have antagonist in fiction. We needed to have protagonist in the fiction. We needed to have dramatized action. We need to have climax. We needed to have resolution as well. But another reason for me to bring up Eichmann is I believe it's important to put his name out there because we needed to investigate this character more. It's important to use him and look into the history and reflect on the history and imagine what was really bad about this. Because when I was researching Eichmann, the more I researched, the more I believed we really need to investigate this character more. Because he denied he played the major role in the Holocaust. He downplayed his role as well. When he was brought to trial in Israel, many people in the US actually believed in his innocence. Many people, including the Nobel Prize winner Pearl S. Buck, stood up for him, spoke for him. They all believed he was innocent. They all believed in his words. So is this truthful of Holocaust? I think we need to look into this.
No, completely. And it's odd because Eichmann appears in both our books as it happens. But I agree with the questions you ask. It's only the question of how you examine Eichmann's role and whether you do it with the documentary record and the facts, or whether we allow ourselves to imagine. But I think that, look, I think people will have, it's not a debate that you're ever going to resolve because in a way there's room for both. But I do wonder about it, like I said.
Yeah, I think we have different venues. We can talk about this in a nonfiction, and we can also talk about it in fiction way. And if that book makes you wonder about what really happened and look into nonfiction or documentary or go to museum, that's wonderful. But I do get angry when people talk about Eichmann, and the more I read about it, only Only last year, when I was wrapping up Night Angels, my rabbi sent me an article on New York Times, which contains the Nazi tape that was Eichmann's tape. And he confessed, he said in his tape, he said his only regret was he could not kill more Jews.
Yeah.
You know, there's a really interesting comment that someone made, which is in the Q&A function. Someone says, do you think that sometimes fiction, especially based on, this kind of, intense research, can reveal a different kind of truth to the narrative? So I think that's an interesting thing that I'm going to leave our audience with, just to think about this idea of these different mediums and what they bring. I have one final question for you that came in, Jonathan, which is someone wants to know, have you sold the movie rights for The Escape Artist?
That's very
and
kind.
when can we see this on the big screen?
Well, that's very, I mean, I can't say what's happened because it's not all official yet, but your question is on the right lines, and there will be something to say on that in due course, but it's not all signed and sealed yet.
All right, well, we will await news. This has been such a pleasure, a privilege. Here are the books. There are links in the chat. Jonathan Friedland, Weina Dai Randel, this has been really, really wonderful. We will be back in person for the next two Unpacking the Book events. Those are April 20th and May 11th at the Jewish Museum in New York City. Our guests will be Jonathan Rosen and Rachel Aviv, Judy Gold and Jeremy Dauber, and we will have more of this fascinating Jewish conversations. So thank you both for being my guests tonight.
Thank you.